Welcome into another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Benjamin Wolk. I'm sitting in Sanford Stadium right now, and I have no clue what in the hell I just watched for a football game. I'm sure that a lot of people that are showing up in the comments section feel the exact same way. One of the most unexplainable, bizarre Sanford Stadium outcomes that I think that I've ever seen. I'm sure that there are people that have been around a lot longer than I have, many of whom I was sitting up with in the press box for this game that said the same thing. This is just as bonkers of a Georgia Tech football game as you're going to find, as bonkers of a Georgia football game as you're going to find. Final score, Georgia 44, Georgia Tech 42, 8 overtimes. Longest football game by overtime periods in SEC football history. I think it was second most in college football history behind the Penn State-Illinois game that went 9 overtimes. Normally, when I come on this show post-game, I like to have created some notes. I like to have a little, all right, here's the bullet points that we're going to go through. Here's the things that we're going to talk about. Let's take a break. Here's some things we'll talk about after the break. I am sorry to everybody that's on this live. I don't have that today. I did not feel like this was a game where you could map out what you were going to talk about after the game because, quite frankly, we went 5 overtime periods of people exchanging 2-point conversions that we had no clue how this game was going to wrap up. I want to start because I know I'm on the Junkyard. You know, I'm on Dogs 24/7. If you're not subscribed, just a quick plug, which is a shameless time to plug this early in the show. But if you're not subscribed, now is the time to subscribe. Georgia's got SEC championship game coming up, possible playoff, possible, signing day, transfer portal, all those types of things. We've got our best special of the year going right now. So I really can't imagine a better night to jump on board with Dogs 24/7 if you haven't already. But just, I was not able to put into thoughts on paper what I was going to talk about on this show because I think I'm going to have to rewatch it. I'm going to have conversations. Jordan's down talking with Kirby Smart and players right now, and I'm sure that he might hop on here at some point. Hopefully he does, and I just have to imagine that they are beside themselves down there given how things went. Again, this is a game that Georgia scored 44 points and was shut out in the first half. These are things that don't make sense. These are things that seem inexplainable. Georgia, just looking at the drive chart, Georgia doesn't score a touchdown on the first 6 possessions of the game. The last 6 possessions of the game, including the 2 overtime periods where they had touchdown opportunities, they scored touchdowns on all 6 of those possessions. This team has a lot that you can complain about. And what I was going to say earlier before I went on my tangent, of which there are going to be many during this, Georgia had many times during that game where I think people wanted to fire Mike Bobo. They probably wanted to fire to Glenn Schumann. I know that, I'm on a lot of angry text threads with Georgia fans. I'm on the Junkyard. I know what the emotions were going through that one when Kirby calls the 2-point conversion that doesn't get converted. There were some things during that game that I think made Georgia fans pull their hair out and think, how does this happen in a must-win game that essentially clinches you into the college football playoff? How does Georgia play like that in a half against that specific program? And this is all, I want to say this, all credit to Brent Key's football team. They were, for a majority of the game, the tougher football team. On offense, Buster Faulkner, their offensive coordinator, former Georgia staff member, you have to give unbelievable kudos to him. They passed for 303 yards and rushed for 260 yards. They actually outgained Georgia by nearly 160 yards in this game. When you start to look at some of the stats, I know our national guy, Josh Pate, throws out the padlock stats. There's a few in this one that I think that if you threw them out, there wouldn't be padlock stats, but I think that you would look at them and say, how did Georgia Tech find a way to lose this game? Georgia Tech ran 84 offensive plays. Now, I understand there was the 2-point conversion back and forth, and that was going to inflate some of the play stats on both sides. Georgia ran nearly 70. But Georgia Tech averages a yard per play more than Georgia, almost 7 yards per play, 11.7 yards per pass, 5.5 yards per rush. Like, when you start to look at some of those things, like, how did Georgia find a way to win the football game? And I think, to me, that's the story of this Georgia football team just in general. When you go look at down 30-7 at halftime, against Alabama, down 17-0 at halftime against Georgia Tech, down 10-0 early against Tennessee in that big primetime game. And you don't find a way to win the Alabama game, but you find a way to come back. And I think that helped establish the identity that Georgia used in this game to pull out the win. This team is never dead. I mean, this team went down 14 with like 5.5 minutes to go. And I think that there were multiple times throughout this game where I said, all right, this is the moment that if Georgia can't get the first down here, or they can't make the stop on Georgia Tech here, like the game is over. And when they let Haynes King, punch it in, they hit the shot, the 33-yard shot, Haynes King to Eric Singleton on 3rd and 8 late there in the fourth quarter, and then Georgia Tech punches it in to make it a 14-point game. I think that most everyone, and I think that the Sanford Stadium stands would indicate this as well, most people thought that football game was over. And it just doesn't matter with this team. There is going to be a level of fight until the end that, for all the flaws and all the faults that this team might have, inability to, stop mobile quarterbacks, or not as strong against the run as past defenses have been, or the drops on the offensive side, like all of the issues that we've talked about with Georgia all year long, they popped up at points throughout this game, yet Georgia never gave up and Georgia found a way to win. And so I think that, to me, that's the takeaway from this game, is some way, somehow, against all odds, even if it was a team that you're an 18-point favorite against, that many people in the minds of the Georgia Tech rivalry feel that it should, they feel that a game like this should never even come close to happening. But to find a way to win, I think, tells you a lot. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, you'll see right now we have a very, 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 very special guest, Mr. Kip Adams. I would love to know. I'm sitting in Sanford Stadium still trying to process anything that I just watched while Jordan goes and talks to players and coaches. You got a slightly different point of view on it from your seats. What the hell did we just watch, Kip?
A team that just got dominated in the first half and they had no answer for Haynes King in this game. And credit to Haynes King and the Georgia Tech offensive line, because, they were pummeling Georgia off the line of scrimmage throughout most of that game. But like you said before I came on, Ben, this team just does not quit. And now, granted, they've given themselves no shortage of adversity this season, and it feels like they've chosen to play this game on the highest level of difficulty possible. And just see, like, can we overcome this? Can we overcome this? It felt kind of like the Alabama game all over again, where a team that seemed down and out, people were leaving, like all the beat writers had their stories ready to roll. And then this is a nightmare for journalists. I know fans, aged decades tonight, but the amount of times that writers had to edit their stories tonight, probably record breaking. If we still had print journalism going strong, we would have lost a couple forests worth of trees tonight over just having to reprint all of these game stories. But this is still one of those where, even though there are a lot of negatives in this game, it's still one of those moments where you look back and say, this could be a turning point for a Georgia team that is one of the most heavily flawed teams of Kirby Smart's tenure. There's no doubt about it that there are holes on this team. You can't look at the strength of schedule anymore or say, Georgia's playing down to their competition. There are issues, especially in the, on defense, where they just could not get a stop all night against a banged up quarterback that looked like, he was every single hit. It was like you're watching Rocky. Like, how many more rounds can this guy go? And the answer was like 7 or 8 more. So I think, this may be a win that feels like a loss, but it is still a win. And this still is a senior class that gets to walk away saying they never lost to Georgia Tech, Tennessee, Auburn, Florida. That's still a rare group. And you have to remember that when you're thinking about how frustrating it was for this Georgia team that came into this game 20-point favorites.
Well, you're exactly right about the lost paper, or, well, thankfully we've moved to a technology age, but the lost paper that there would have been, because, you go read my rapid report card. One, I didn't know how to grade these guys in this game, Kip, because when you score 44 points, but you were shut out in the first half, what kind of offense did you play? When you can't make a single stop when you need to, and then you get all these 2-point stops that you need to have, I thought that the defense put Georgia in a really bad spot in this game, just unable to get off the field. Georgia Tech getting chunk play after chunk play. Couldn't really get much pressure. And then you get to the overtime period and they're running 2-point plays, and Glenn Schumann dials up a brilliant one with Dan Jackson. CJ Allen blitzes and didn't get the sack, but affected Haynes King enough. I mean, there were some things that you can point to in every facet of this game. To your point, Georgia has clear flaws this year. There are things about this Georgia football team that have not existed on past Georgia football teams. And we've said that all year long, and we see it every single week in different areas. But it's like, do you judge them for that, or do you judge them for the fact that when you're down 14 with 5.5 minutes to go, Georgia Tech has a 3rd and 1 where if they pick it up, the game's over, and Dan Jackson puts his hat on the football, and all of a sudden a miracle is still, within reach. I can't believe what we just watched. One thing I do want to do, Kip, I kind of just want to run through statistically like what Georgia did today, because offensively it wasn't a great game, but they also kind of got the job done in situations when they needed to. I mean, Carson Beck's stat line alone, I think, tells that picture. 28 of 43 for 297 yards. I think that it tells you a lot how they handled running the football, and I think there's an irony to it that they hand the ball off and finally get the 2-point try to get Nate Frazier to punch it in and win the game. Georgia just couldn't run the ball tonight. I mean, they were struggling to run the ball all night long. I mean, I think when you look at the final stats, the Arian Smith, 1-yard run for 30 yards kind of inflates all of that. You remove that, it's 25 carries for 78 yards. Not a great performance running the football. So they were relying on Carson Beck to find a way to will them into that game. And, he didn't have gaudy passing yardage numbers, but he threw for 5 touchdowns. Like I mentioned right before you came on, I mean, Georgia scores touchdowns on its last 6 possessions of the game, the last 4 of regulation, and then the 2 of overtime. So, offensively, you get the job done, but certainly not a pretty game. Spread the ball around to 10 different receivers in those 297 yards, so got a lot of folks involved. On the flip side of that, I think there's a lot of people that you can point to that had some costly offensive mistakes in that one. I mean, the Arian Smith drop early on in the first possession of the game on that 3-and-out. Dom Lovett has a couple costly drops, obviously has the fumble. Nate Frazier might have gotten away with a fumble because of some favorable camera work. I don't know. You might have a better look had a better look than me at that one at home, but caught a break on that one. But all of that to say, it was not a pretty game for Georgia. I mean, it goes without saying. I mean, I said it before you got on, Kip. Georgia Tech throws for 303 and rushes for 260. If you told me before the game that Georgia Tech was going to outgain Georgia by 160 yards, I would have said that game didn't even make it to overtime, and I would have said, how the heck did Georgia let that happen? But despite all that, Georgia finds a way. I want to take a quick break, but Kip, give me some thoughts right before I do so.
Just the over 15 minutes in difference in time of possession. I mean, 37 minutes of possession for Georgia Tech was crazy. And they averaged like 6.7 yards per play in this game. So on paper, you thought Georgia Tech had this game by, double digits, and it really looked like for most of the game. I mean, they honestly did.
All right, going to take a quick break. When we come back, I've got a couple of questions for you, Kip. I've got a couple of things that I want to know what you think, and I'll sort of give my thoughts on them as well. And then, depending on how the chat's behaving, I might open it up to some comments to share from them as well. All right, Kip, I didn't think when we woke up this morning that 2-point conversions were going to be the topic of the day. Before I get into the overtime, we'll get into that in a second. I want to know, someone asked about this a couple people asked about this. Nelson Wu is one that I see right here about not understanding why Kirby Smart goes for 2 early. I'm curious to know what you think. Like anytime Kirby Smart does something like that, there is logic-based reasoning for it. He's not just going for 2 without any reason. I'm fascinated to know. I hope Jordan's able to hop on at some point so he can explain what Kirby Smart said about that, because I know he's going to be asked about it, because again, when you get into an overtime game, that 1 point, meant everything. What do you think he was doing there?
I mean, obviously there's an analytics guy now that doesn't have a job anymore in Athens who gave him the numbers on that. But especially after knowing just, I guess, the hit rate on 2-point conversion plays, now that we know that there were several other plays that would not have worked had they gone for it there on our side. And yeah, hindsight 2020 or whatever, it made absolutely no sense mathematically then. You did not really, there was no advantage to be gained by going for it unless you just thought, I don't want to go to overtime. I want to end this thing in regulation and go in and take the lead. That's the only thing I could think of, is that they were just trying to avoid overtime period in this game. But when you were, chasing points that early in the third quarter, it again, it makes no sense. Also, again, going for it on 4th down. Like you left 4 points on the, on the board there, and we all could have been, already just sleeping off all the turkey we've consumed over the last 40 hours. So I don't know what he's going to say. It's probably going to be very spirited. Whoever asked on the Georgia beat, Godspeed to you tonight. But I can't imagine he's going to give an answer that does anything but defend the person that told him. But I think the call was indefensible at the time, and I think it still stands true now.
So I don't know. And I really hope that Jordan is able to hop on. If not, it's 12:43 a.m. and he probably wants to get the hell out of here as much as anybody. So if you're listening to this, Jordan, and you heard me say that, don't feel guilted into jumping on. But my thought is that that made it 17-16. And for anybody that's not an analytics nerd, which I don't consider myself one, but I've heard enough people talk about it, that when you're down 14 in the second half, the theory is that when you go for 2-point conversions, which we learned tonight is a shady statistic, but the theory is that you go for 2-point conversions, you get it over 50% of the time. And so when you're down 14, you go for 2, because if you get it the first time, the second time gets you an extra point and you win the game. Or the first, you don't get it the first time, the second time you go for 2, and theoretically you get it over 50% of the time, you'll get it and you'll tie the game. In this situation, Georgia's down 17-0. So I think they were using similar logic, where it's like, all right, you're down 17-0, you're going to have to get 2 touchdowns. So if you get it over 50% of the time, if you get it the first time, then now if Georgia Tech scores another touchdown, you're still within 2 touchdowns. So you're still within 2 scores. If you don't get it, then it looks kind of silly. So it's like, that's where the analytics side of it always is confusing to me, because it's like, yeah, sure, it's great if you get it, but if you don't get it, then it's like, what position do you put it in? Now, I guess the analytics guy is probably sitting there saying, Coach, I told you it wasn't going to cost us the game. I told you that if you go for 2 there, we're still going to have a chance to win the game. But it was a lot more of a headache than it probably should have been. I do think that, if you get the 2-point try the first time, and then score another touchdown and kick the extra point, it's now 17-15, assuming you haven't given up any other scores. Now a field goal wins the game in regulation. Again, I'm not defending the decision. I'm just trying to understand the logic of where the math was coming in that was making them do it. I was dumbfounded by it, but Kirby Smart doesn't make those types of decisions typically. That decision, and then the decision to go for it on 4th down early in the game when it's 4th and 2. I don't hate the decision to go for it, but you're down 3 early. And now that we know this is a 44-42 game, every situation and decision mattered. Both of those were uncharacteristic Kirby Smart decisions. It just felt like things that Kirby Smart typically doesn't do, which leads me to believe that there was some kind of justification for it. But again, until I hear what he has to say about that, I'm going to share the opinion of a lot of the commenters who are saying they are not really sure what happened. So let's follow up some 2-point conversion talk with some more 2-point conversion talk, Kip. It looked for a minute there like Georgia's fate on the year was going to be decided on how the committee viewed Georgia's ability or inability to get or not get 2-point conversions. I mean, right now, Georgia's sitting there with a 2-point win, and the committee's going to say, all right, they won the game, and that's all that matters. All it took is for Georgia to not get a 2-point conversion and Georgia Tech to get one. And we're looking at maybe number 15, number 16 Georgia that has to win next week to be able to get into the college football playoff. What do you make of this? I know we've talked for years, like eventually there's going to be a game like this where 2-point tries back and forth are going to decide the national landscape fate of one or two teams. What do you think? What do you make of this format and how it went down tonight?
Well, I'll be blunt. I think it's honestly ridiculous. And the college football Reddit Twitter/X account was having a field day with this. I think my favorite one was talking about if Georgia's stuck in infinity overtimes, Alabama goes to the SEC championship game. And then there was the Dr. Pepper challenge in the 8th overtime. That was tweeted like in the 4th overtime, not thinking we'd actually get to 8 overtimes. But yeah, I mean, we saw firsthand that this was put in place to try and shorten the overtime system. But these two teams found a way by tripping over themselves repeatedly and stepping on every rake they could to extend the game even more. But I will if we're going to give some credit in a game that Georgia was out-coached for most of the night, I'm going to give Kirby credit. He called those timeouts in overtime as perfectly as you could. Every single time he was using his timeout that you get, which I will admit, I learned tonight because of this, that you get a timeout in every single overtime, because I never really had to think about that before.
And they sure made sure to use them, didn't they?
And he used almost every one. But the best part was when he got the sideline warning to give his team an extra timeout through the sideline warning. That was my favorite part because
I didn't even pick up on that, Kip.
Yeah, he got I mean, obviously I'm making an assumption here, but I really think he basically bought an extra timeout by getting that sideline warning. So I think again, that helped. I mean, again, if you're given a sideline warning that you can use, then he just said, "Hey, that's an extra timeout for me," and he used it. So I will give him credit to where I think that was his thinking, because we gotta call like we see it. In regulation, not great, Bob, but in overtime, kind of a masterclass. And so, yeah, there are some positives here, and I think whoever, if he knew that ahead of time or he got advised that, credit to him or whoever, because I think that worked out really well, because the number of snaps the defense was playing, I mean, we were at like 140 at one point. So those guys were beat to death. So he gave them some extra time when they needed it most. And every single time, while we were on that roller coaster, you thought, this game's lost. And it took every single one of those timeouts. I mean, every single second for them to be able to stop them when they needed to. So, yeah, I do think that he gets credit for that. And I think that'll probably be something where they have to go back and say, all right, well, he kind of worked the system a little bit. We probably need to change the ruling there.
Yeah, I mean, it reached a point. I mean, I sent out the stat on it, after I guess it was the third 2-point try experience. Georgia and Georgia Tech were over 7 on 2-point tries to start this game, on a game that was going to be decided exclusively by 2-point tries, which sort of tells you the ridiculousness of it. I mean, I think that the play of the game was Dan Jackson's forced fumble, because if that doesn't happen, nothing that happened after it happened. The play of the game to me, aside from that, was in whatever overtime it was. I can't even keep up at this point. Georgia doesn't convert. Georgia Tech has it. They attempt to pass with Smile Munden in coverage. He gets called for pass interference. I couldn't quite tell. It looked like there might have been a little bit of a tug, little iffy call, but that half the distance to the goal. It sounds like such a small thing, but 1.5 yards on a 2-point try versus 3 yards on a 2-point try completely changes what Georgia Tech was going to try and do. And quite frankly, Georgia Tech did exactly what I thought that they were going to do in that situation, which probably played into Georgia's favor and how they approached that play. But they tried to get in with Haynes King's legs, And I don't know who all was involved. I'm sure Nas Stackhouse was in there. I'm sure Michael Williams was in there. But it was just a collection of bodies that said, whatever happens, we're not letting him get this 1.5 yard. And that was, I'll admit, that was the moment right after the Smile Munden pass interference where I said, I just don't see how you stop them again from 1.5 yards out. I mean, all game long when Georgia Tech needed 2 yards on 3rd and 2, 4th and 1, third, 2nd and 6, just to make it a manageable 3rd down. Like, it felt like Georgia Tech got those 2-3 yards every single time. And for them to not get it in that situation, in that overtime period, arguably saves Georgia's season. But to your point, Kip, a bit ridiculous that the game like that was decided. I mean, I've got to imagine, Brent Key, Buster Faulkner, they just coached up one of their best football games that they've probably ever coached up. I don't think you can talk about this game fairly without crediting both of them for how they had their unit ready to go. And just, there were points in that first half, especially where Georgia Tech absolutely manhandled Georgia up front on both sides of the ball, just completely whipped them. And so for them to lose a game in 8 overtimes like that because of 2-point conversions, I'm sure that Brent Key is going to be sick tonight, having to think about all the opportunities where things were missed and the fact that it was decided that way. So I do hate that games like this are going to be decided in the future by 2-point tries. And we've said for years and years that we knew games like this were going to happen eventually, and it would be kind of ridiculous. And I realize they got to have an answer for something, but hate for either team to have to lose a game in that fashion. Yeah. Jordan did say he was going to be able to hop on in a few minutes, so I don't know whether or not he's going to be able to do that, Kip. I know you do your game ball story. I'm curious. Give me one of your game balls on each side of the football. I can start if you want to decide which ones you're going to go with. On the defensive side, I've said it enough times. I'm sure that this is probably your front runner as well. Dan Jackson. He forces the fumble that changes the game. He had a key 3rd down stop early in the game that was important as well. He has the sack in overtime, which I was given Glenn Schumann some flack in that one, just because it feels like whenever this style of offense with this style of quarterback plays Georgia just never has any answers. And then you watch, Oklahoma play Alabama last weekend, and it feels like they have an answer for every single possible thing that a guy like Jalen Milroe can throw at you. It just feels so predictable that this Georgia defense is going to struggle in these situations. But for him to dial up a couple of those blitz calls in those overtime periods on those 2-point tries, I think it pressured Haynes King in a way that he just hadn't been pressured all game long. So got to give the kudos to Dan Jackson. And then on the offensive side of the ball, I guess you got to go with Carson Beck. He threw 5 touchdowns.
Yeah. I think you nailed it. For one, you have a couple deep balls a game where Carson Beck, he hasn't been able to connect on it. I think we're going on really 2 seasons now where it's just the part where you have to have the timing and the accuracy. And it really is the only part of his game that we've never really got to see developed. But you take out a couple of throws, and he was really dialing it up. And it was a situation where the pass protection was very inconsistent. He had to step up and make a ton of throws off platform. Honestly, the only time where I really was kind of questioning was the one overtime. The 1 2-point conversion play where of all the times for him to keep it, I was like, now you're going to run the keeper with Carson Beck. That's the one thing where, they're not going to see it coming because you haven't shown it maybe 1 or 2 plays all year. When you do that zone read and you never keep the ball, it's an aspect of where their eyes are never going to go to you. They're always going to go to the running back. So when he just tucked that thing and started going and then immediately just ran into Xavier Trust and all of his momentum was lost in that play, I was just like, man, it feels like he's a little snake bitten. But yeah, he's still a hell of a game from him. Again, no turnovers. You're throwing 43 passes. You're going to get sacked a time or two. I think he got sacked twice. Like you said earlier, just dialing it into so many different players. I will say, though, Cash Jones was the most clutch player in this game. And so this is kind of, I guess we're going to just call this the walk-on bowl. Because, Cash and Dan Jackson were the ones who wanted it most. When Georgia needed it most, those guys came up with clutch plays. And so those are kind of, if I'm not giving the Carson, or if I'm splitting it, you gotta throw Cash Jones some love, because I mean, he had I think the biggest offensive plays, other than obviously, Nate coming in there and winning the game when we wondered where he kind of been for a while. But I do think that Carson, if it is probably his last game in Athens. We'll see what happens, obviously, in this SC championship game. But I mean, if he's not going to play between the hedges again, I mean, it's been an up and down season, but you really can't ask for much more from your quarterback. He stayed, he waited for his chance. He still has a chance to, it seems like they're in a position for him to get his first playoff, experience as a starter. And, his story isn't written yet, so you can't write him off. He's now had, it's 3 games now, no turnovers? I mean, there was a stretch there where we were wondering what the over-under was going to be. Are you going to set it at like 2.5 for any given game? And so now, I mean, he's taking care of the football. And so I think you got your guy playing high caliber football when you need it most. So I like your game ball picks. I do think you have to give some credit to the, several players in this team, because overall, I mean, it wasn't the performance you should have gotten from a team perspective. There were some guys out there that you could tell, they still wanted it. They still put forward the effort level, and they're rewarded for it. Like I said before, I mean, this is a senior class. It's already got the record for wins, and now they have a chance to, make their way into history books with some postseason play.
Just when you think we're about to wind it down, I was about to say I'd overstayed my welcome in the scores room. I had some people opening the door behind me. Just when I thought we were about to call it a night, not so fast. We have Mr. Jordan Davis Hill on the call. He was just down talking to players, talking to Kirby Smart. Jordan, what's the vibes down there?
People are tired, boys. People are feeling it. I had to get the exact quote from Chaz Chambliss. It's going to be in one of my stories, but I asked him how he felt. He said, "I'm tired, but I feel like a winner." So, I mean, they found a way. I think they're all trying to wrap their heads around what just happened. And I'm sure I missed the first probably 32 minutes of this, but I'm sure you guys spent the majority of it trying to figure out what exactly happened. But I think you're talking about a worn out team, but I think you're talking about a team that's super glad this was on a Friday night. They get an extra day to rest before they turn their attention to either Texas or Texas A&M.
Well, if people were looking for a show to make sense of what happened in Sanford Stadium, this was not the right show for them. I can assure you everything that I said does not help them process anything that happened. We got a lot of questions about this, Jordan, so I have to ask, even though there's probably more pressing things about this game now. What did Kirby Smart say about the 2-point try in regulation?
He said essentially that's what the card said to do. So, boys, that was what they did. I mean, he really wouldn't say a lot about it other than they followed the analytics, and that's what the analytics said. I don't know if either one of you guys kind of laid out the thinking or the reasoning. I didn't get it at the time. I understand. I'm someone who has a big problem a lot of the time when they say, like in the fourth quarter, and you're down 14 and score to go for 2. So I think it falls in line with that, but it's not something I subscribe to. And as Kirby pointed out, that did loom large when you could be kicking the extra point to win the game. So I think it was warranted to wonder what exactly was going on. But Kirby basically said cards said to do it, so they did it.
Okay, no, I mean that probably answers Kip's comment, or that probably speaks to Kip's comments that there might be an analytics guy, being.
Is it Arthur Smith? I mean, that was the math still does not math. The only thing the analytics card could have said was, I want to go home early. I don't want to go to overtime. And guess what?
I tried to explain it. I will say, I'm sure there's an analytics. If there's an analytics person out there that does, for whatever reason, listen to me talk about football, and I completely butchered the explanation for it, I would love someone to reach out and explain to me the math on it, because I tried my best, but I'm sure it was blatantly wrong. And I was probably just, carrying Kirby Smart's analytics guy's water for him.
Kip, you said that Arthur Smith has had something to do with that. He's too busy angling for that North Carolina job. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people tonight that were hoping that, in the first half that he doesn't get that job. We'll see. I mean, we'll see how that situation goes, but yeah, I think whatever was written on that card was probably written in crayon and, probably handed, to Kirby by Paul Johnson at halftime or something, because it just feels like you don't chase points in the third quarter. I've never seen him do it before. It was out of left field. And I mean, hopefully we never see him do it again, because I just think that, yeah, you guys would have been home and asleep an hour or two ago if that card hadn't been handed to Kirby tonight. So,
well, we never would have gotten to experience this absolutely blasphemous football game that we got to watch. So, Jordan, I appreciate you hopping on. Kip, I appreciate you hopping on. I don't want to have the 2-point try be the only thing that I ask you about, Jordan. So I'll let you give your parting thoughts on this absolutely ridiculous football game that we just watched before we sign off.
This was not a pretty game from Georgia, but once again, when Georgia has its back to the wall, they respond. And they've done this several times this year. The one that specifically comes to mind for me is that drive on offense against Texas after, the play with all the trash, and Texas has the momentum, and it's a big third down, and Carson Beck hits Arian Smith, and they convert, and that winds up being a big drive. You think about the long drives against Tennessee. You think about the comeback against Alabama, although it wound up not mattering. I mean, that was still an incredible comeback. This team isn't perfect. This team has a lot of flaws. We saw it tonight, but it's resilient, and I do think that that's worth something. And I think that given what you have ahead and the tests you're going to face, whether or not you win the SEC title game, there's some value in that resiliency. Is it going to be enough to win a national title? I don't know, and nobody knows, but I would say that that's worth something.
No doubt about it. Unreal, 44-42, 8 overtimes. Georgia pulls out an absolute stunner. We'll have plenty of content throughout the weekend, obviously being a Friday night game, slightly different content delivery probably, but also there's going to be a game tomorrow night, Texas at Texas A&M. I believe it's 7:30 Eastern kick on ABC. Georgia plays the winner of that game next week. So despite everything that you went through, still a big game next week.
Follow along on the Junkyard. We will have a Texas A&M thread. Come on, jump on board with us and follow this game, because we're going to be watching it closely, because Georgia's going to play whoever wins it.
All right, y'all. Well, for Kip Adams, for Jordan Hill, I'm Ben Wolk. We still have no clue what just happened, but we know that it was a fun one to watch. So thanks, everybody, for joining us.